My name is Don DeBatz, and like your speaker today, I'm also a fellow at the Virginia Foundation for the Humanities. It's a pleasure to introduce Professor Pat Sullivan to you today and to welcome you all to this lunchtime talk organized by the Virginia Foundation for the Humanities. And on the organizational side, we need to be mindful of finishing by 1 o'clock. And Ann Spencer will help us with about 15 minutes of questions at the conclusion of Pat's talk. In some ways, this talk is a joining of a circle for Professor Sullivan, who began her work to define and establish new directions for the study and the understanding of the civil rights movement of this country at the University of Virginia some 28 years ago, when she was a fellow at the Carter Woodson Institute at UVA, working with Amstead Robinson. From there, she's journeyed to the W.E. Du Bois Institute at Harvard and visiting professorships at Virginia, Berkeley, Emory, Boston University, and she's presently a professor of history at the University of South Carolina. She has had fellowships at the National Humanities Center at Research Triangle, North Carolina, where we first met some years ago, and at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, among many others. She's authored 3 important books on the U.S. civil rights movement and edited another 3. Her history of the NAACP, Lift Every Voice, the NAACP and the Making of the Civil Rights, was a finalist for the Robert F. Kennedy Book Award. And that takes us to Pat's present book project at the Virginia Foundation for the Humanities, Robert F. Kennedy, Civil Rights and the Racial Crisis of the 1960s. And it takes us to Pat Sullivan. Thank you, Pat.
Hey, thank you, Don, and I want to thank Rob Vaughn and Ann Spencer and the Virginia Foundation for supporting me this semester, and my fellow fellows, and all of you for turning out today. The topic of my talk today is Robert Kennedy, Race and Politics During the 1960s. And it's a talk that kind of brings me full circle in the way that, or a project that Don just mentioned. In the summer of 1966, Robert F. Kennedy traveled to South Africa at the invitation of the National Union of South African Students for a 4-day-long visit. He walked through black townships and white suburbs, addressed mass meetings, participated in discussions, and met with students, learning firsthand about life in the land of apartheid and drawing comparisons with his own country's long struggle with slavery and racial segregation. During a public dialogue in Durban, a white South African claimed that black servitude was justified by the Bible. Kennedy responded, "But suppose God is black? What if we get to heaven and we, all our lives, have treated the Negro as inferior, and God is there, and we look up, and he is not white? What then is our response?" Suppose God is Black provided the title for an article Kennedy wrote about his trip, published in Look magazine in August of 1966. Now, such a query by a major American political figure would be a head-turner at any time. But it had particular significance during the summer of 1966, when the promise of the civil rights movement appeared to be fast dissolving into a brew of white backlash and black power militancy. Race riots, images of Black Panthers, and claims about the deficiencies of the black urban poor reignited longtime white prejudices and fears, particularly among northern whites who were compelled to confront a problem they had long associated with the South. Robert Kennedy brought a rare sensibility to the deepening racial crisis of the mid-60s. His understanding of race as a defining force in American life, and his response to the human consequences of a long history of racial segregation and inequality took him beyond a liberalism anchored in New Deal Cold War, in the New Deal Cold War era. It shaped his political leadership and ultimately helped to influence his decision to run for the presidency in 1968. This largely unexplored dimension of Robert Kennedy's experience and public evolution is a focus of the project I'm currently working on. The story of his development and relationship to the racial struggles of the era is a fascinating one on its own terms. But more significantly, it helps recast the civil rights the era of the civil rights movement by linking the Southern civil rights struggle as it crested towards victory with escalating protests in northern cities, a convergence that journalists, political figures, and government officials, that forced journalists, political figures, and government officials to confront not only the stark brutality of the Jim Crow South, but also the deeply entrenched segregation of the urban North. So this afternoon, I will briefly highlight some of the themes I will be exploring during the major periods that frame this book. Racial change in politics during the 1950s, the formative years of the Kennedy administration, and the emergence of Bobby Kennedy's public leadership after 1964. So briefly, the 50s. Born in 1925, Robert Kennedy reflected the dominant racial attitudes of his times. But politically, he stood apart from the civil rights Cold War liberalism that dominated the National Democratic Party during the post-World War II era. In a 1964 interview, when asked about the extent of his awareness of, quote, the situation of the Negro in America, Kennedy began by responding, well, I don't think we were extra concerned about it when we were growing up. There wasn't any great problem. I know it's the worst thing in the world to say that some of your best friends were, but as I was growing up, I suppose 2 of my 4 best friends were Negroes. And so it was all sort of accepted. And you know, there was never any thought about the fact that there was anything different. We did grow up with the idea that there were a lot of people who were less fortunate and a lot of people who were hungry during the 1930s when he was very young, and people had a difficult time. And white and Negro people were all put in the same category, and that you had a social responsibility to try and do something about it. But as far as separating the Negroes out for having a more difficult time than the white people, well, that was not a particular issue in our house. Now, in terms of his early, this is a 64, he's talking to Tony Lewis, and he does mention one incident, but doesn't claim it as an epiphany, but it's very interesting given that we're here at the University of Virginia. He was a student at the University of Virginia Law School from 1948 to 51, and he was head of the Student Legal Forum during his 3rd year. And as part of that, they invited notable figures to come speak, and he had all kinds of access through his father. But one person they invited was Ralph Bunche, who had just recently received the Nobel Peace Prize. Bunche said he would come, but he would not speak before a segregated audience. And apparently the policy was here that they didn't really enforce it, but segregation was the policy on campus. So he went through several levels to try and get a firm statement to assure Ralph Bunche that this would not be the case, ultimately going to President Colgate Darden. And thanks to my friend Mike Plunkett, I found the 5-page letter that Bobby Kennedy wrote to Darden explaining that the McLaurin decision had been ruled on in 1950 about education and segregation in higher education. And so Darden agreed, Ralph Bunche came, and one thing he said in his letter, these talks are not a big deal. You know, a handful of people show up. Cabell Hall was packed, and 1/3 of the people in the audience were African American. But as I said, he didn't turn around and notice that Charlottesville is segregated or, you know, take on the larger issues in the society. As a dear friend of mine, Robert Carter, who was one of my mentors, the late Robert Carter, mentioned once, in the years prior to the 1960s, racial discrimination was not only operative in all aspects of American life, but generally accepted as a norm. This was just the way things were. And, you know, we really, as a teacher, you really have to help students understand this. But significantly, as I just mentioned earlier, Kennedy was not invested in this narrow framing of civil rights and racial issues that developed within the Democratic Party in the late 1940s. And the ADA, Americans for Democratic Action, were a major force in really isolating progressives who were, you know, linked with the left and, you know, communists, non-communists, but very active in sort of an inclusive democratic movement that linked racial issues to economic issues to political issues. And it was a very vibrant period from really the 1930s up through World War II and after. And sort of as emblematic of the retreat from this spirit, in 1951, the same year that Bunche came to UVA, W.E.B. Du Bois, at the age of 84, was handcuffed and arrested for failing to register as a foreign agent because he had been director of the Peace Information Center, arrested by the Truman Justice Department. and you didn't hear any protests from any major white liberals in the Democratic Party over that. So what you had in the late 40s, you know, Truman had this famous report that really contributed to his re-election in 1948 to secure these rights, and those recommendations, a wonderful, expansive report that sort of is incorporated into the Civil Rights Act of 1964, but it's a dead letter by 1949. So issues of race and economic justice were pushed to the margin of American politics and remained there during the 1950s, even as the NAACP moved forward and won the historic Brown decision in 1954, Montgomery bus boycott in 1955, the murder of Emmett Till. And again, these are all issues that our students know, but the country just goes along. You know, nothing changes. At the same time, the 1950s is a period of accelerating migration of African Americans to the North, and this transformation, continuing transformation of the nation's racial landscape. 1.5 million African Americans come north just during the 1950s into increasingly overcrowded tenements, substandard housing, poor schools, poor health, criminal, police harassment. I mean, just raw urban experiences. And of course, Malcolm X, the same year as Brown, becomes the head of the mosque in Harlem and really begins to articulate and the nation provides an outlet for people living in these abysmal conditions that are very much beyond the notice of electoral politics, Democratic Party politics, Republican Party politics. Now, Bobby Kennedy during the 1950s, he leaves UVA, goes to Washington and moves in the world of Capitol Hill. You know, famously, as everyone loves to remind you, he worked for Joe McCarthy. And he did work with Senator McCarthy on his committee for 6 months. Actually, the work he did was a study on allies trading with China. But he did work there, and then he went and worked for the Democratic side of that committee. He became most noted for his work on the Senate Rackets Committee, an aggressive pursuit of the Teamsters, and corruption in labor unions. But of course, the main thing he's doing during the 1950s of great significance for his future and his brother's future is, you know, becoming RFK's most important advisor and strategist, starting with the 1952 Senate campaign, 1956 when he attempts to get on the vice presidential ticket, and of course 1960. Robert Kennedy was, by this time, I mean, ruthless were words people associated with him, but he was a remarkable, brilliant political strategist, and he was most responsible for electing the first Catholic to the White House. He was, you know, Plouffe and Axelrod, maybe he, you know, could even take them to task before the internet and all of that. I mean, he was really outstanding. And of course, the 1960 presidential campaign, he kind of followed the script that Democrats did in this balancing act between the Democratic South and the Northern black vote. It was, civil rights was an issue to be managed, to try to thread this needle. And of course, they have that amazing incident very close to the election when King is arrested and taken to jail out in rural Georgia, and both Robert and JFK intervene in a way that leads to him being released from jail. And you know, that could have been the turn on the black vote coming across. I mean, Daddy King had supported Nixon, after that Kennedy, and he wins by a very close election. Now, with the inauguration of JFK, you have, you know, Robert Kennedy's extraordinary ambition and political talent sort of merge with an escalation of the Southern Civil Rights Movement. Of course, the sit-ins happened in 1960, but again, they didn't sort of turn things. I mean, they would. The student movement would ultimately force the country to pay attention. But of course, you know, he moves into the eye of the storm as Attorney General. And what I'll talk about now as we move into the years of the Kennedy administration and beyond, this sort of the man in the times, you know, that here he is, and he's placed in this position, and he has to respond to the increasing demands on the Justice Department and then on what's unfolding in the South with tremendous speed. You know, one of the key things is that he puts together an extraordinary team. Burke Marshall, Katzenbach, and he has a holdover from the Eisenhower administration, John Doar, who came into the Justice Department towards the end of that administration. And there's a story a day or two after he's established in the office, Doar, there are some issues in Louisiana about a farmer being evicted from his land because of a voting issue. So Kennedy tells him to go to Louisiana and look into that. They said John Doar left, went to National Airport, and went to Louisiana. And he said, keep him on, you know, I mean, he was on top of things. And Doar had really begun to make great advances in investigating voter violations. And they were an amazing change. I mean, I think the Eisenhower administration had 5 cases. Within a year, 100 cases in the Justice Department were being pursued. Staff was expanded. Tellingly, his first public address as Attorney General was on Law Day at the University of Georgia, again in response to the invitation of a student. People said, should he go there, you know, right away to the University of Georgia on Law Day? And of course, it had just been desegregated several months earlier by Charlene Hunter Gault and Hamilton Holmes. Kennedy went and spoke to an all-white audience, except for Charlene Hunter Gault, who was covering his speech for the student newspaper, and basically said that, and at this point, 2% of the black children in the state, 7 years after Brown, were attending desegregated schools, 2% in 1961. He told the audience in a long speech that talked about a number of things, but basically he said, Brown is the law, and the Kennedy administration will enforce civil rights statutes. And he told them in such a way that at the end he had a standing ovation. Okay. But again, going south and saying that. And the freedom rides really, though, pushed his hand. Okay. It got beyond his control, beyond cases. I mean, when you had the bombings of the buses and this very public assault on these riders. And testing the government, because the Freedom Riders, often not mentioned, is that they were riding in response to a court case. I mean, a case that had come up through the NAACP, Boynton versus Virginia, and they were testing that. There had been a case in 1946 as well. So the courts had ruled, and they went to ride, and as their rights were provided for by the Supreme Court. And of course, as you've seen, hopefully you've all seen Stanley Nelson's amazing film. And so in response to that, I mean, they had to make deals with Eastland to try to get these, and other Southern political figures to get these students through alive. But at the end, they had the ICC implement a ruling banning segregation of interstate transportation. Now, by the summer of '61, James Carroll, many of you may know him, a columnist, he was an intern in the, working for the FBI. And he talked about going to hear Kennedy was giving an address to college students working in the Justice Department that summer. And 40 years later, he recounts what it was like. He recalls his vivid memory of Kennedy at the podium, his hair tousled, his shirt sleeves up, his palms slapping the wood for emphasis. What remains with me as a source of a life-changing epiphany was the context of his speech. Instead of the expected diatribe against communism or crime, the Attorney General spoke with feeling about civil rights. He identified the end of racial segregation as the most important challenge facing America. This is summer of 1961. And the Justice Department. It was shocking to us, especially those of us from the FBI side, since the Bureau was almost entirely white. For Kennedy to identify himself with the movement and bring its agenda into the heart of the government was to represent a transformation in the making, personal as well as political. So again, a sign, someone witnessing a change. Now, of course, his responsibility for formulating civil rights policy tested these razor-sharp political skills, his fierce dedication to his brother's success as he's engaging powerful Southern Democrats, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, and the insistent demands of civil rights groups, while seeing racial realities that had long been invisible to him in the South and in the North. Now, during these years, again, political pressures, whatever, I mean, judgeships, appointments of federal judges in the South that were abominable and really the bane of civil rights activists during the early 1960s. Late in 1963, after much pressure from J. Edgar Hoover, and as John Siegenthaler said to me, you have to remember, people really were worried about communists in the early 1960s. He agreed to a temporary wiretapping of King's phone. Now, JFK was assassinated before that wiretap could be, it wasn't taken off. So you have those pieces in there. But I think the point is this is part of a dynamic picture, and these are some of the issues I'll need to untangle as I get deeper into this study. But a critical point in his education during these early years that's often overlooked is that his education on race was not limited to the drama unfolding in the South. Early on in the administration, his attention was focused on conditions in the urban North. And from what I've learned thus far, I mean, one source says that it was really campaigning in northern cities. I mean, they went into the ghetto, just like into West Virginia, seeing the poverty, white poverty in West Virginia, going into northern cities and just seeing the conditions in these cities. And then many statistics coming out about juvenile delinquency, crime, family instability, and the rest. And they started to have a sense about something very explosive in these places and really horrible social and human conditions. Another thing I think they probably saw was Mike Wallace's film on Malcolm X, The Hate That Hate Produced. You know, that was aired in 1959. And, you know, showing Malcolm X as sort of, you know, stirring up people in northern cities. But their response to it was really on a very human level. In May of '61, the President's Committee on Juvenile Delinquency was established. That was a big issue in the 50s, right? And it was composed of Bobby Kennedy as the chairman, and also Secretary of Labor was on the committee, and the Secretary of HEW. So they're spreading it out across the government, and the aim was to strengthen the social structures within these communities and coordinate all levels of government activity around juvenile issues and youth services. It was run out of the Justice Department, out of Kennedy's office, and it was chaired by his high school friend, David Hackett, who was the model for Phineas in A Separate Peace. They were best friends. And if you've read that book, you know, Phineas was quite something. David Hackett came in full of enthusiasm, got in touch with the leading social scientists and community activists, Richard Cloward, and later Francis Fox Piven, the Mobilization for Youth in New York, and they began really what is defined as the first federal agency to work directly with community leadership in poor neighborhoods, and beginning to invent what would become community action programs that would be the foundation of the war on poverty. Very cutting edge, experimental, and grounded in these communities, getting really working with cities, getting applications from around the country for cities to begin working with this program, to begin working with youth around jobs, education, and getting them involved in this. By virtue of this work, and again, Kennedy very much in contact with Hackett, is out of his office, they are really seeing what's happening in these cities and increasing black militancy during 1962 and 1963. And what you see in Kennedy's talks is a discussion of the race problem as a national problem, not a regional problem. Just some excerpts from speeches he gives in '62 and '63. The Negro was called the white man's burden in the 19th century. Our treatment of the Negro is the white man's burden in the last half of the 20th century. He said that in '62. The problems that remain in this country are massive. The results of racial discrimination carry on generation after generation. When thousands are offered inferior educational opportunity, they will suffer a loss that can never be compensated. You know, just seeing youth and sort of the human toll of these conditions. To face this openly and try to meet it squarely is the challenge of this decade, he says in Kentucky in March of 1963. Speaking about black militancy, he says, this is to be expected. The problem is not going to disappear overnight, or even if you pass a law in Washington. This is systemic, this is structural, this is ours. Speaking on 100th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation in April of 1963, he said, now time is running out fast for this country. That's April of '63, okay? In May of '63, they felt that time had run out. Birmingham explodes. And again, you know, we think of civil rights as this seamless. No, it ebbs and flows. Freedom rights, people are paying attention, it sort of retreats a bit. Birmingham blasts it wide open. And not only in Birmingham, we all remember the images of the hoses and the dogs turned on the children. But what happening is black people are in the streets fighting back. Once Martin Luther King's hotel is bombed, that's it. And things are getting out of control. There are protests all over the country, some edging towards more militant responses than what people came to assume from the Southern movement. As Malcolm X said, the specter of blacks willing to defend themselves will force the government to act. Now, there are tapes of discussions, meetings in the White House in response to Birmingham, and JFK says, "Is this the black Muslims?" He had to see that program, Malcolm X. And Bobby Kennedy said, "No, it's not the black Muslims. This is real." I mean, you don't need the black Muslims for people to be responding this way to these conditions. So what Bobby Kennedy does is massive meetings, a month of meetings, Birmingham, Washington, New York, on many fronts. In Birmingham, trying to get an agreement and put a lid on things. In New York, talking to business owners who own these Southern stores, asking for voluntary desegregation immediately of lunch counters. And then with business people, philanthropists, educators, religious people, to try to create the support for aggressive civil rights legislation, to build that infrastructure to actually get a bill through Congress. And during this period, he has this famous meeting with James Baldwin and his friends. Kennedy had read the essay that The Fire Next Time is based on in the New Yorker that was published in November of '62, and many of us, I'm sure, have read that, which is this Baldwin, this powerful indictment of white ignorance of the nation's racial history and its devastating human and social consequences, really taking attention beyond the South to the country, right, especially to the northern urban areas. So how this meeting came about was, there are many ways, but Kennedy, once he knew Baldwin wanted to see him, he was ready to see Baldwin. And they met briefly in Hickory Hill, but Baldwin's plane was late, so they arranged for a meeting in New York City the next day. And he said, ask anyone you'd like to come. I want to hear from people. I want to talk to people. So Baldwin had an interesting group he pulled together. One of the first people who called was Lena Horne, who said she didn't fly. She was in California. She was on a plane within hours. Lorraine Hansberry, Harry Belafonte, Kenneth Clark, who was the major advisor on the Brown decision, professor at City College, Clarence Jones, who was King's lawyer, and a few other people. And and the main person, really, for what happens is Jerome Smith, who had been a student activist in Louisiana from the sit-ins onward, had been beaten, was in New York for medical treatment for a fractured skull, and he was the wounded, right? He was from the front lines of the battle. And this meeting is a stark demonstration of this gulf in experience and understanding between Kennedy and Burke Marshall. He had Burke Marshall with him, and these, Baldwin and his friends and colleagues. It went on for 3 hours, and Kennedy began by laying out what they had done, and they'd done more than any previous administration, what they were planning to do, and really seeking their help and support. The election's coming up, and he really felt that they could all be on the same page, talking about things. Kenneth Clark said, I felt like he expected us to be grateful. And Jerome Smith breaks the ice. I mean, there's some pleasantries. And he basically says, being in a room with you makes me want to vomit. And he just unloads. Kennedy turns from him. Lorraine Hansberry says, don't look at us. He's the one person in this room you should be listening to. And it goes from there. And he attempts to engage, and it is just relentless. He doesn't get it. He makes one comment about his grandfather was an immigrant from Ireland. As Kenneth Clark said, that was the worst thing he could say to this group. And so it just goes on. 3 hours of just grievance, question, attack. And in the end, Lorraine Hansberry rises and says, I'm leaving, and they all leave, and he's left there. He was initially furious about it, as were they. And Kenneth Clark described it as one of the most violent verbal assaults I've ever witnessed. Then he said, the fact that Bobby Kennedy sat there for 3 hours and took it proved that he was among the best white America had to offer. Shortly after the meeting, Kenneth Clark told the New York Post columnist James Wexler, we might well have been speaking different languages. We were unable to communicate clearly and skillfully that this was not a group of Negroes begging the white power structure to be nice to Negroes. We were trying to say that this is an emergency for our country, for America. This never got over, he said. But then barely 2 weeks later, JFK makes his first major speech on civil rights. And Clark is shocked. He said, they must have had a tape recorder in that room. So many of the ideas and things they emphasized were incorporated into that speech. And of course, Bobby Kennedy had a major role in the working of that speech. Just talking to Kennedy, a lot of it he ad-libbed JFK. And just a quote from that really wonderful, amazing speech, which shows just a turn in the understanding of the Kennedy administration. The Negro baby born in America today, regardless of the section of the state in which he is born, has about half as much chance of completing high school as a white baby born in the same place on the same day. 1/3 as much of a chance of completing college, twice as much of a chance of becoming unemployed, a life expectancy that is 7 years shorter. This is not a sectional issue. Difficulties over segregation and discrimination exist in every city, in every state of the Union, producing in many cities a rising tide of discontent that threatens public safety. It is better to settle these matters in court than on the street, and new laws are needed at every level. But law alone cannot make men see right. We are confronted primarily with a moral issue. It is as old as the scriptures and as clear as the American Constitution. And of course, that's prelude to the March on Washington that summer, the introduction of civil rights legislation going forward, and the poverty program really moving along, where they've moved towards this maximum feasible participation concept. They have 14 sites, and JFK has said poverty would be a major focus of his reelection campaign. And of course, he is dead within less than 6 months after he gives that June speech. Now, with the assassination, everything pretty much stops for Bobby Kennedy in terms of his role. The poverty program, I mean, Hackett is suspended, you know, power vanishes, as one observer put it. And the personal loss, you know, I've talked to people who were there days after William Vanden Heuvel. They said, you have never seen grief as you saw in his face. I mean, it was just all-encompassing and devastating. And when you look at his moving forward, and there's a kind of, not a liberation in the death, but a liberation in the moving outside of that administration and finding his own path, his own voice. Jack Newfield, who was in that, you saw the picture, he was in that crowd outside the Justice Department. He said, I hated Bobby Kennedy in 1963. He looked like every Irish kid who used to beat me up on the way to school. But they became close friends. And what he commented, looking at Kennedy during this period from '64, he said, experience began to stretch Bobby Kennedy. Tragedy transformed him, okay? And I think that is a pretty convincing reading, because in the void created by his brother's death, initially he's very concerned about securing JFK's legacy, but also finding his own place in public life. And it revolves around a deepening connection to the civil rights struggle and the suffering and injustice that it exposed. And, you know, the passage of the Civil Rights Act, which Bobby Kennedy and his colleagues played a leading role in crafting and lobbying for that summer. Also the Economic Opportunity Act, which they weren't aware, LBJ was not aware of this maximum feasible participation clause. Later, he talked about the kooks from the Kennedy administration, but they got that in, and that, again, is very important for the early war on poverty stuff. That comes through in '64, but also in '64, you have your first sort of series of urban riots that summer. Harlem, Bedford-Stuyvesant, Rochester. In each case, Philadelphia sparked by police violence, and it really influences the tone of the '64 campaign. Goldwater's push for law and order, and it sharpens Kennedy's focus on this crisis that he always saw, and now its expression in these disturbances. He comments that America's racial crisis was the greatest problem facing the country since the Civil War. So he's elected to the Senate in January of 1965, and this is when he really begins his public leadership as a political figure in his own right. And I won't get too deep into this. This is me very cursory, and I'm just at the front end of this project, but there's enough to track that he uses that as a platform for a deepening engagement with the problems of race, poverty, and white indifference. I mean, that's always on his top piece of any kind of engagement with this issue. Just as racial tensions are heightening, white backlash politics are growing, and the escalation of the war in Vietnam is increasingly infusing political and social concerns. And if you look at this period, the emphasis is on that, this kind of declension. And the press, emphasizing racial polarization, sensationalizing black militancy, and stigmatizing black poverty. But you have a whole group, and Kennedy can kind of take you to some of them. I know them from my other work, of activists, and of course King is among them, activists, policymakers, social commentators, who keep attention on structures of poverty and racial inequality, and develop strategies and programs that build on the community-based politics that were inspired by the Civil Rights Movement. As a senator and a national political figure, Robert Kennedy emerged as an important voice, strategist, and doer in this loosely defined social and political project, which is very important up through 1968. Robert Carter, who I mentioned earlier, he is this massive northern school desegregation campaign in the courts and in communities that sort of builds on Brown. And in April of '65, Kennedy makes a statement in a speech: "We have gone as far as goodwill and even good legislation will take us. We must now act to bring about changes in the conditions that breed intolerance and racial discrimination." Now, I think a very telling speech is one he gives on August 18th, 1965, in Spring Valley, New York, to a sort of a civic group, mostly white civic group. The Voting Rights Act had been signed earlier that month, marking the final legislative triumph of the Civil Rights Movement and the Southern Civil Rights Movement, and culmination of efforts that Kennedy had been so key in shaping during his time as Attorney General. But he doesn't talk about that night. He wants to talk about the unfinished business of the civil rights struggle. During the previous week, rioting in the Watts section of Los Angeles claimed 34 lives and reduced the area to rubble. "I want to speak to you tonight," he began, "about the dead and the orphans of the rioting in Los Angeles, about the sick and the distressed in all of our urban ghettos, and about what we can and must do." While allowing that all Americans should take pride in the accomplishments of the Civil Rights Movement, he emphasized that dangerous and even more difficult challenges remained. In the months and years that followed, he worked to mobilize the nation's will and resources to meet the crisis that he described as unparalleled in our history. The first step, he told this mostly white audience in Spring Valley, is to move beyond thinking about this as a Negro problem. He went out to Watts with Peter Edelman, his young aide, who went to work for him in '63. Peter said it was like seeing a war-torn area in one's own country for the first time. Kennedy, like King, King goes to Watts as well. They're both shaken, deeply shaken by Watts, believing that unless something was done to redress these conditions in urban areas and stem growing white hostility, segregation and violence would become more pronounced, and in Kennedy's mind, explosions like Watts would be inevitable. So when King takes his campaign north to Chicago, Kennedy pushes forward on a number of fronts to raise awareness, speaking out in various forums, and working with a handful of aides to develop and advance a legislative agenda to initiate and promote job creation and training. And of course, the war is starting to sap money away from these poverty programs. So he's got that struggle in Congress. But what he really wants to do, like King going to Chicago, he wants to create a program himself that builds on all that they learned with Hackett's work and in the Justice Department, build around the concept of community participation and control. And by the later 1960s, that community participation and control had eclipsed the failed promise of integration as a primary vehicle for enriching black lives and expanding opportunities. And after months of preparation, they took a year, and Adam Walensky and Peter Edelman and a guy named Tom Johnson just went around the country to these cities where they already had contacts through the work that Hackett had done to talk to people, black activists, militants, mayors, business people about how to create something, sort of a private-public partnership that could do the work of revitalization and redevelopment. And in December of 1966, they launched the Bedford-Stuyvesant Restoration Project, the first community development corporation in the country. And I won't go into a lot of detail about this. Jack Newfield has a great piece on this in New York Magazine that he writes right after the assassination. But it's an extraordinary, imaginative program that sort of, again, looks away from the traditional dependence on welfare and public housing and counters Moynihan. And we hear a lot about Moynihan. You don't hear Kennedy. He's the counter voice to Moynihan, who is infamous report talks about on the Negro family, claiming that black pathology and family breakdown is the fundamental source of weakness in urban black communities. Kennedy's looking at the structures, you know, that people don't have a chance to work their way out through jobs, through education, and just the horrific conditions. So this project attempts a holistic, systematic attack on the interconnected problems of the community: job creation, economic development, housing restoration and construction, welfare reform, health and recreation, and depended on a unified community represented by elected black leaders from the community working to decide what would be done, how it would be done, who would do it, and a separate board comprised of businessmen who provided access to funds and management experience. And he had access to a number of people in New York who agreed to work with him. And it's very interesting to hear about their accounts. The only two to turn him down were David Rockefeller and Daniel Patrick Moynihan. He didn't believe in this approach. And so this really becomes a major focus for him, and he hopes it'll become a model that can be adopted in different parts around the country. Now I'm going to speed up and wrap up so we can talk, but I think what's interesting about this period, people I've interviewed, things I've read, Marion Wright Edelman has said, you know, Bobby learned by going places and listening to people. Right? Cesar Chavez said he had the ability to grow and be changed by experience. When I told Kathleen Cleaver, a former Black Panther I was working this book, she goes, people need to know about him. He changed. You know, we're not used to our political figures changing, growing, especially around this issue. And so he really, this concern about poverty and the people on the margins, he's drawn out to California where he begins working with the migrant workers and Cesar Chavez. He goes to Indian reservations and begins holding hearings on these egregious federal policies and their consequences. And he's continuing to go to urban areas, and he goes to Mississippi in '67, which is an interesting circling back. Marion Wright testifies before the Senate Labor Committee. He says, I want to go. She said, the last thing I needed was another senator down here, you know, to bring the cameras and the press. And of course, he comes with Peter Edelman, and she was just astounded. She said he went to places I wouldn't go, and held children, and saw. And later, they got to be friends because she marries his aide. And she tells a story that later, sitting out in Hickory Hill, he says to her, you tell your friend Martin Luther King to bring the poor people to Washington and to stay there until Congress does something. And she suggests that this is a link. You know, King may have been thinking about that, but she did communicate that message to Dr. King. Now, of course, as he anticipated, the summers got worse. '67 was the worst. Newark, Detroit, Harlem, and the response by now, I mean, Johnson is besieged. The war is going badly, escalating. War and poverty is shrinking, and his response to these riots is massive military. I mean, for Detroit, 47,000 paratroopers, 3,000 National Guardsmen, armed helicopters and tanks, and no mention in his address to the nation of the underlying causes of those explosions. Kennedy insisted on the rule of law, spoke out against wanton burning, killing, and looting won't be tolerated, but he insisted that increased law enforcement was not the answer. Frank Mankiewicz said to him, well, what would you do? He said, well, after stopping the violence, what I would do is convince TV networks to go into these areas and show the country what living conditions were like, right? Let them show the sound, the feel, the hopelessness, and what it's like to think you'll never get out. Show a black teenager told by some radio jingle to stay in school, looking at his older brother who stayed in school and is out of a job. Show the mafia pushing narcotics. Put a candid camera team in a ghetto school and watch what a rotten system of education it really is. Film a mother staying up all night to keep the rats from her baby. Then I'd ask people to watch and experience what it means to live in the most affluent society in history with no hope. And then he'd hope you could bring together business and community leaders and local people and cobble together plans like a Bedford-Stuyvesant experiment. Two events in February of '68, and we can talk about this. Everybody, if you're my age or in the zone, you have opinions about the '68 campaign. But from what I've read and from what I've learned in this study thus far, two events were catalytic to Kennedy's decision to run. The Tet Offensive, in February of 1968, which just totally blew Johnson's optimistic claims about the war, and the Kerner Commission report, which Lyndon Johnson just kicked to the curb. You know, the report that said we are two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal, and Johnson wouldn't even consider it. He announced, he decided before the New Hampshire primary, I've read, and he announced after the New Hampshire primary. And in his, you should look at his announcement. It's not too long, but he begins, I run to seek new policies, policies to end the bloodshed in Vietnam and in our cities, policies to close the gaps that now exist between rich and poor, between young and old, in the country and around the world. And of course, we all know what happened. He had a 10-week-long campaign, such a dramatic contrast to the America he saw from the one he saw in 1960. And King's assassination happening right at the front end of that, his impromptu speech, and telling a crowd in Indianapolis what had happened. His win in Indianapolis with 85% of the black vote, 60% of low-income whites, many who had voted for George Wallace. This sort of seeing the potential of creating sort of a new politics. And of course the win in California, white, black, Hispanic, and then the assassination. So, you know, I was saying to this, I don't know how to end this, and so maybe I'll just end it there, because you can think about, you know, what if, but besides what if, I think knowing, coming through this history, and he is this person who went, looked, saw, and as a scholar following him, you see things, that '68 looks a little different than it might. And here's, I'll leave you with a quote, again from his South Africa trip, how he saw the movement. At one point he said to Jack Newfield, this is bigger than me, you know, this campaign, these issues. And he really got learned what the civil rights movement represented, not as sort of the actual accomplishments, but how you did it, how you built a movement, why you did it, and what the legacy was. And he said in a speech, the road toward equality and freedom is not easy. The great cost and danger march alongside us still. And still, but even in the turbulence of protest and struggle, there is greater hope for the future as men and women learn to claim and achieve for themselves the rights formerly petitioned by others. So let me leave it there and entertain your questions.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Wasn't it after the New Hampshire primaries that Bobby Kennedy decided to run?
Why?
Wasn't it after?
Yes, it was. Well, what his aides say that they said for personal and political reasons, he decided not to announce until after. And you know, I just finished listening to Cairo's book, and blood feud is blood feud. And because back then they were saying the same thing, and every move he made, he felt was through the lens of he doesn't like Johnson, and he didn't like Johnson. But by 1968, there were bigger issues on his mind than his personal feelings for Lyndon Johnson. So, but he did, I mean, G. McCarthy had a good showing in New Hampshire, I think 42% of the vote, and so it looked like, you know, there was a possibility here. And of course, people don't want to run if there's no chance of winning, maybe. But I think it's a complicated question. It was a hard decision for him to make, and of course, it didn't turn out very well.
Yes. Actually, I have just follow up. It was Joe McCarthy's performance that I had in mind when I had forgotten Joe McCarthy's name. And Bobby Kennedy said he didn't run because he didn't want to divide the Democratic Party. But after the New Hampshire election, he said, the Democratic Party is already divided, therefore I'm running.
Okay. That sounds like a good explanation. And I think that certainly was a concern of his, a concern of electing Nixon. And I would appreciate that comment, because that sounds, here comes the opposition.
I'm not going to reinforce the point that was just made here. But you and I have discussed this. Okay. I'm curious about what, given the antipathy between Kennedy and Johnson, did Kennedy's thinking have any influence on Johnson with respect to civil rights legislation?
You know, what's interesting is that Johnson was against the introduction of civil rights legislation in 1963, right? And that could have been, you know, people, again, is it time? Can you get it through? I mean, they've all had experience on Capitol Hill. But I think that Lyndon Johnson brilliantly engineered the passage, and again, with work had been done as part of JFK's legacy. I mean, with the country just mourning the loss of their president, this was one of the last things he did was to give that speech in June, well, major speech, and to introduce the civil rights legislation. So Johnson moved that forward, strengthened it, and got it passed. So, you know, when you think of Kennedy Johnson, again, the personalities are so compelling, but to my mind, especially during this period up till, say, 66, when Johnson really gets bogged down with the war, they both were so critical to what was achieved in terms of the Civil Rights Act and a lot of those changes, you know, in leading the country forward. But I don't know if that answers your question, but I think it's interesting that, you know, he wasn't for the legislation in 63, but once it went forward, and and of course, he wanted to run for president in 64, and Johnson, as a Southerner, I mean, liberals looked at him as, you know, not strong on this issue. So I think there was probably a political motivation, but the major point is he got it done, and he got it through, and that was a huge achievement, as well as the Voting Rights Act, too.
One point of view that I've heard that I'd like for you to respond to is that the Kennedy brothers were forced into civil rights, supporting civil rights due to political pressure.
Mm-hmm. I've heard that, and I had no, like, and now, given what I've studied, no. I think that what's interesting, I think Robert Kennedy definitely was as Attorney General, right? He was on the front line there. But I think together, from what I've read expansively and researched, that they both were committed to this issue. It was a question of timing, right? A question of timing in terms of legislation. And of course, they are looking towards re-election in 64. So what's interesting to me is that in 63, they're going to go forward with this, risk losing the South, and make poverty a major focus of the 64 re-election campaign. So they started to see the country in different ways. I think they grew in ways, and the political possibilities were always changing because it was, you know, such a tumultuous time. But I think they had a basic, they didn't have hostility to it, and I think as they learned and came along, you know, they were for it. But I think what's also important that we need to think about contemporaneously is that the pressure was there that enabled them, pushed them to move and enabled them to move. You know, organized pressure that had been building up for decades. And, you know, by the early 60s, it was so strong that there was political capital. You know, you could go forward and feel that your leadership would help to realize the power of that pressure.
Well, I guess to follow from that, I mean, there's a debate in social history about the role of social movements in creating change and the relationship of social movements to political figures.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess this is to ask sort of where maybe your work stands in those debates. I mean, would you point to Robert Kennedy as a kind of individual with a particular kind of political agency that was autonomous from these social movements, or would you say that really the social movements are what created this kind of shift in attitudes and ideas on a number of different levels, including within a sort of political circle like those, like the one that Robert Kennedy inhabited?
Mm-hmm.
It's in a way it's a different way of asking the question, the previous question.
I think, I mean, that's an important question. I guess scholars, we like to come down on one side or the other, and to me, you couldn't have had the civil rights movement without both. I think there's a kind of leadership that that responds to pressure, but then navigating the politics of this country around race. You just can't decide to do it. I mean, you have to know how to do it and have a sense of political strategy, but also a commitment to it. You know, and I think what he embodied, I know more about RFK than JFK. And again, they worked in tandem, but I think in the case of Robert Kennedy, he had tremendous feeling about this issue as well as political sense about it, and he responded to what was happening around him. Stanley Nelson told me the Freedom Riders loved Bobby Kennedy. They did not like JFK. What? They had access. People had his phone number. And I think that doesn't, I mean, the movement's there, but whether you're going to get a Civil Rights Act out of that movement, you know. I met a reporter about 10 years ago who worked for the Baltimore Sun. They took a bet in the press pool if the Civil Rights Act would pass in '64, and they bet no. You know, so the political strategy and leadership in tandem with the pressure, right? So, you know, I don't know if you were saying either or, but I guess theoretically, I'm not sure where I come down because I'm still sorting it out. But I think scholars have largely discounted the role of political leadership. It's all movement, the movement, right? You watch the Freedom Rides, you think you go from the Freedom Rides to Kennedy's speech in '63. That's how the movie ends. No, Birmingham. And Birmingham was about this country was coming apart at the seams. There was going to be war in the streets. That's not kumbaya and we shall overcome. That's like, oh my God, time has run out. You hear that in this, time is running out. And Malcolm X said that. You get people in the streets, black people, they will pay attention, right? Now you say, why do they pay attention? Because they're afraid, or this gives them leverage, right? Country, it's time to move. And I think someone like Kennedy, his inclination, he wanted to move things along and to begin to deal with these issues, and seeing this as such a deeply entrenched issue in the country, and the mentality, the structures. And the thing about him too is his relationship with young people. You know, Peter Edelman told me he walked to Harlem in March of '61, went up to do an interview, and he said Bobby loved to walk. And he would see these young people, you know, and he saw, when he said, you deny education, you can never make up for that. And he saw the human face of that. It wasn't abstract. So I think that sort of feeling in a political figure who's navigating between movement, leadership, strategy, and just, you know, having a sensibility about the human costs and consequences. So that's something I'll keep in mind as I go forward, though.
Hey, great talk. I just was very intrigued by that little piece that you went into at the end, Johnson's response to the Kerner report, because, you know, my impression of Johnson has so much to do with his shepherding the civil rights legislation, even though he was, you know, initially opposed to it, him really shepherding that through. So I'm just kind of curious about that kind of contradiction, or what kind of blind spot that might indicate in terms of your understanding of his character?
Well, I mean, Johnson never forgave King for coming out against the war in Vietnam. Johnson felt the way that, Kenneth Clark and those who were reacting to Bobby Kennedy in that meeting. He thought people should be grateful. He did great things, and he did. But by 1968, he is like, he's in a bad place. He's got a war that's totally lost, really, off the charts. He's got protests. He has, and his, and he was furious. The lead guy on that commission died within the last year. And I talked about it. Johnson never spoke to him again. The lead guy in the Kerner Commission report. He was furious with the report. And you asked a good question, the why. I need to look more closely at that. Because it's just, but at that point, he, couldn't take that kind of, he felt responsible. It's a reflection on him, right, that these things are at such a state. And,
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thanks all.